All right, so in this recording, this is the final chapter of Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind to God. So this chapter is called The Spiritual and Mystical Transport of the Mind, in which rest is given to our understanding and our affection passes over entirely to God. Okay, so what does all that mean? So essentially, we've gone through 6 steps in this ascent to God, and so at step 6, you sort of get at the precipice, right? That's where you are. You've done all these great steps in getting to that point where you've seen God in the external world, internally, and now you've to some degree seen God directly in of His divine love and light, or divine light, as Bonaventure put it. Um, but this is an intellectual journey. The experience of God is when it's really what's desired here. And so at this point, you have to be taken into God. You cannot do it yourself. So this is where he talks about the spiritual and mystical transport of the mind, right? In which rest is given to our understanding. That means your intellect at this point has to stop. Your inquiry has to stop. And then your affection, which is your desire for God, your love for God, is what takes you into God. Okay? So that's what that title means. So what I'll do in this recording is really just read some of these passages and to point out what's going on here. So again, chapter 7 is no longer a step, right? This is where this is the encounter with God proper, and how he's describing to some degree how it can happen, right? He's sort of pointing to it, but he can't really tell you how it happens. So in the first paragraph, he says, accordingly, the mind has reached the end of the way of the 6 contemplations. Okay, they have been like the 6 steps by which one arrives at the throne of the true Solomon and at peace, whereas in an inner Jerusalem, the true man of peace rests with a tranquil soul. So you know words like rest, words like peace, okay, and words like tranquil. Oops. All right, these are all words that signify sort of the ceasing of intellectual operations. Right, at this point, you need to be at rest. That means you stop striving, right, and you need to be at peace, where everything's whole, quiet, and you have this sort of internal cohesion, and you're tranquil. All right, and then I'll read the next passage. It says, after a mind has beheld God outside itself through and in vestiges of him, okay, that was steps 1 and 2, and within itself through and in an image of him, that was steps 3 and 4, and above itself through the similitude of the divine light shining above us, and in the divine light itself, that was steps 5 and 6. Okay, right, and then I'm going to skip a few lines, and he says, when the mind has done all this, so you've gone through all 6 steps, it must still, in beholding these things, transcend and pass over not only this visible world, but even itself, right? So he's saying the mind must transcend itself. Okay, so you've transcended the visible world, right? You've ascended through these very interesting, engaging 6 steps, but that's not it. That's not enough, right? Yeah, you have to transcend yourself. Now, I'll then move to number 3, paragraph 3, or actually 4. Okay, so he says, in this passing over, this transcending of the self, if it is to be perfect, all intellectual activities ought to be relinquished. Okay, so all intellectual activities ought to be relinquished. So I'll read that again. In this passing over, if it is to be perfect, all intellectual activities ought to be relinquished, and the loftiest affection transported to God and transformed to Him. So what we're seeing here is some sort of dichotomy between intellect, and I'll just say versus affection slash desire slash love slash will. Okay, right. So what he's saying here is when you've gotten to this step, your mind has to stop. There's nothing you can do. You can't figure out anything. You can't understand anymore. What's left now is just pure love for God. And that's what it is that will take you beyond yourself, right? Okay. So if you notice, the first six steps were complicated, right? And Bonaventure felt he could teach us, right? He could go through these different steps and go through these very complicated philosophical and theological ideas. But he says now here, he says, um, this transcending of yourself, however, is mystical and most secret. Okay, so this transcending of self is most secret, and he goes on to say, which no one knows except him who receives it, and no one receives it except him who desires it, and no one desires except he who is penetrated to the marrow by the fire of the Holy Spirit, whom Christ sent into the world. Right. So at this point, this transcending of oneself by love and desire is secret. It is personal, and cannot be taught. Right. So if you get there, you can do it, right? If you have this love for God, you can do it. But otherwise, no one can teach you. So at this point, Bonaventure says, I've taught you all I can. I can't teach you anymore. So number 5 then goes on to say, I'll read some of this. And since therefore nature avails nothing, so let's just write that, nature avails nothing. So what does that mean? That means there is nothing there's nothing in your power that you can do at this point, right? Your nature, you've done all that's in your power to do. So your nature is not going to do anything more for you, right? You've done everything that you can. So I'll read that again. And since therefore nature avails nothing, and human endeavor but little, little should be attributed to inquiry. Right. So at this point, don't try to investigate or use the mind to try to figure out stuff to understand. Right. Um, So I'll read that sentence again. And since therefore nature avails nothing and human endeavor but little, little should be attributed to inquiry, but much to unction, little to the tongue, but much to interior joy. So here he presents these sort of dichotomies, right? This, stop, um, try to at this point encounter God by your own effort, but rather let your love take over. Now, further in that paragraph 5, he has some very interesting concepts here. So he's praying to God. He says, O Trinity, essence above all essence, and deity above all deity, supremely best guardian of the divine wisdom of Christians. So now this is important. It says, direct us to the supremely unknown. Okay, so to direct us to the supremely unknown, super luminous, okay, and most sublime height of mystical knowledge. Okay, so he describes what we're trying to achieve as supremely unknown and superluminous. So let's just look at this word superluminous. So super means above, right? It's the opposite of sub. Okay, so super means above. So in this case, he's saying superluminous doesn't mean really bright. It means above light. Right? That's what he's saying. Okay, so superluminous is not something that's really, really bright. Like we think of Superman, who's like really strong. But this is superluminous means above light, and it's supremely unknown. So he goes on to say, there, new mysteries, absolute and changeless mysteries of theology, I shrouded in the superluminous darkness of a silence that teaches secretly in a most dark manner. Okay, so again, he uses this phrase, superluminous darkness. Right? So what's above light? It's darkness, right? So he's saying essentially, the closer you get to God, the more you move away from light and you move into this divine darkness of God. Okay, and it's there's a silence there because your words really fail, right? Words are simply just they encase concepts, and basically your words fail, and any concepts you have fail. And so you have the superluminous darkness of a silence that teaches secretly in a most dark manner. And he says that that is above all manifestation and resplendent above all splendor. Okay, so Bonaventure is somehow, in some way, a theologian of darkness. That is, the closer you get to God, the darker it becomes, right? Because light signifies, clarity, right? You have your concepts, your categories, everything is sorted out neatly. But at this point, for Bonaventure, he says, actually, when you begin to experience God, all those things fall away, right? And you get darkness and you experience God in this primal way, in a way that is beyond all category and concept. So he says he's talking about this superluminous teaching, and he says in this place everything shines forth a darkness which fills invisible intellects by an abundance above all plenitude with the splendors of invisible good things that are above all good. All this pertains to God. So again, he's breaking down category. So he talks about the good above all good, right? So essentially, it's whatever you can think of as good. You're dealing with something here that's even just way beyond that. And then in number 6, he gives us some interesting sort of dichotomies here to think of. He says, if you wish to know how these things may come about. So he's saying, I can't teach you, right? Because the intellect has to stop. And at this point, it's really just your love and desire. So at this point, if you wish to know how to get to this point, he says, you ask grace, not learning. Okay? He says, you ask desire and not understanding. He says, you pray, okay, as opposed to diligence in reading, right? So it's not a matter of studying, okay? Um, and he goes on to say, the bridegroom, you ask for the bridegroom, not the teacher, right? So in some sense, you're getting married to God. You have this intense love for God. So that's what you need. You don't need a teacher at this point. You look for God, not man. You look for darkness, not clarity. Okay, that's sort of an interesting um, metaphor there. So you look for darkness, not clarity. And he goes on to say, but the fire that you look for the fire that wholly inflames and carries one into God through transporting unctions and consuming affections, right? And then he then uses the metaphor of death. And he says, he who loves this death can see God, for it's absolutely true that man should not see me and live, right? So to some degree, you have to metaphorically die to yourself, right? So he ends by saying, he has an ending paragraph which ends in a prayer, but I'll give you the first sentence in that paragraph. He says, let us then die and enter into this darkness. Okay, let us silence all our cares, our desires, and our, let me get this under here, imaginings. Okay, so he's saying at this point, to let us then die. That means in some way you sort of metaphorically kill yourself. You suppress all your abilities, right? And you throw yourself into this darkness through love. You silence all your cares, all your desires. That's your physical desires, all your imaginings. That's mentally you're trying to understand things, and you give yourself completely over. Okay, and so this is the essence of chapter 7. So this is where, at this point, you've gone through all 6 steps. 6 steps have taken you right to the precipice. Like you can sort of see where you have to go, the promised land. But at that point, your intellect has to stop, and God grabs you at this point through your love and desire for God. So one thing to note that a couple of things that are interesting here. If you recall with Plotinus, right, it was pretty much the same thing, right? Plotinus, once you get to this stage where you're right before the one, and then we said it grabs you suddenly, right? Like there's really nothing you can do. Just the one just grabs you, and there you are, face to face with the one, like the heart of existence itself, right? So that happens with Plotinus, right? So we see this, in some way, the similarities, right, between Plotinus and Bonaventure. And we also saw it with Plato and with Plotinus. This description of philosophy as a preparation for death, right? Because right now we're sort of in the cave dealing with shadows, right? And our bodies are holding us back from seeing things as they truly are, right? And at some point, we'll be free from these bodies and we will see the forms and things as they really are. But we're preparing for that through philosophy, okay? So that's what Plato and Plotinus. This is also similar here in Bonaventure, right? Bonaventure is saying that we essentially need to also die metaphorically so we can enter into this darkness. It has to be this sense of death, of giving up on yourself. But one major difference between Plato and Plotinus, right, would be the role of the material world, right? So for Plato and for Plotinus, the material world, the world that we see, was problematic and it was deceitful, right? And it was distorted, and it was the world of shadows. Yes, with Bonaventure, the material world is a shadow, but it is a vestige of God. It tells us a particular truth. So with Bonaventure, as much as philosophy is a preparation, a theology of preparation for death, um, Bonaventure embraces the material world, right? And feels like the first 2 steps, which we said were concerning God and the vestiges of the world, right? The world is a vestige of God. Those were necessary steps, right? Before he took the step into the mind and then to God, and then he got to this point. Okay, so this is the culmination of Bonaventure's journey of the mind to God. And one last point is that Bonaventure sees St. Francis as the true model of this ascent to God.